Tonight, someone in your life will die. Not literally, not today, but somewhere, right now, a person is standing over a body, deciding what to do with it. They will wash it. They will dress it. They will place it in the ground, or in fire, or in water. You will probably do the same thing someday for someone you love. But here's the strange part. This ritual feels ancient to you. It feels older than memory. And it is. It is far older than you think, and far stranger than you were ever told. For most of human history, there were no funerals. Not the way you imagine them. No caskets, no headstones, no priests reciting words over a still body. For nearly 2 million years, early humans simply walked away from their dead. A body was left where it fell. Predators took what predators take. Nothing marked the spot. Nothing was said. Why would anything change? Then something did change, and nobody fully agrees on when or why. In 1957 and 1958, a team digging in a cave called Shanidar in northern Iraq found something that would rewrite the story of human tenderness. They found a Neanderthal skeleton, an adult male, buried deliberately in a shallow grave. Around the body, the soil contained unusually high concentrations of pollen. The excavator, Ralph Selecki, proposed something extraordinary. He suggested the Neanderthals had laid flowers on the body. Actual flowers. A funeral bouquet, 50,000 years before the word funeral existed. For decades, this idea became famous. It appeared in textbooks. It appeared in documentaries. It reshaped how people saw Neanderthals, not as brutish animals, but as beings capable of grief. Then, more recent research complicated the picture. In 2020, a team led by archaeologist Chris Hunt re-examined the site. They found evidence that solitary bees, which burrow into the ground and drag pollen with them, may have contaminated the soil. The flowers might never have existed at all. So which version is true? Nobody knows for certain. And that uncertainty is the point. Even now, with modern tools, modern science, modern minds trained for decades on this exact question, researchers still cannot agree on what the first human funeral actually looked like. The line between accident and intention is that thin. The line between animal and human is that thin. But something else at Shanidar was never in doubt. The body was placed in a shallow pit. That part was deliberate. Someone dug a hole. Someone lowered a body into it. Someone chose that spot over every other spot in that vast cave system. That decision, by itself, changes everything. It means a creature looked at death and decided it deserved a response. What was that response exactly? Not comfort, not closure, not the way you'd recognize it. Early burial wasn't about the person doing the burying feeling better. It was likely about something far more practical and far colder. A decomposing body attracts scavengers. Scavengers attract danger. Burying the dead may have started as pest control, not poetry. Except that explanation stops working the moment you look at what people actually buried alongside the bodies. At a site called Sung-Hir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered 2 children buried head-to-head, covered in thousands of ivory beads. Each bead would have taken hours to carve by hand. The math is staggering. Some estimates suggest the beadwork on those 2 burials alone represented over 10,000 hours of labor. 10,000 hours for 2 children buried in permafrost, where no living person would ever see the beads again. That is not pest control. That is grief translated into labor. That is a community saying, without language, without writing, this loss mattered enough to cost us something we cannot get back. You do the same thing today. You spend money on flowers that will wilt within a week. You buy caskets built from hardwood that will never be seen again once the lid closes. You fly across the country for a funeral, at real cost, for a ceremony that lasts under an hour. Why? Paul Pettit, an archaeologist at Durham University who has spent decades studying Paleolithic burial, argues that these acts were never really for the dead at all. They were for the living. A grave with beads, with ochre, with tools placed carefully beside a body, is a message broadcast to everyone still breathing. It says, "We are the kind of people who do this." It says, "When you die, we will do this for you too." That single idea might be one of the oldest social contracts humans ever made. Ochre appears again and again at these sites. Red mineral pigment, rubbed onto bones, sprinkled into graves, painted across skulls. At Kafsa Cave in Israel, burials dating back roughly 100,000 years contain red ochre alongside human remains. Archaeologist Irela Hovers, who studied the site extensively, has argued that ochre used this early suggests something beyond survival. It suggests symbolic thought, a color chosen not because it helps you hunt or hide or eat, but because it means something. Red, across countless unrelated cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, keeps showing up at the edge of death. Blood is red. Life leaving the body is red. Maybe that color became the first shared symbol humans ever agreed on, without ever needing to write it down. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because if burial required intention, if ochre required symbolic thought, if beadwork required 10,000 hours of grief made physical, then the emotional lives of these early humans were not simple. They were not just reacting to smell or danger or instinct. They were mourning. Actually mourning, the way you understand the word. Does that surprise you? It shouldn't. Not really. Elephants stand over the bones of dead herd members for hours. Chimpanzees have been observed carrying dead infants for days, refusing to put them down. Grief, in some form, may not be uniquely human at all. What is uniquely human is what came next. The ritual, the repetition, the insistence that the same actions be performed, in the same way, every single time someone dies. Psychologist George Bonanno, who has spent his career studying how people process loss, has found something that early humans may have understood instinctively, long before anyone studied it in a lab. Ritual doesn't just express grief, it contains it. A structured sequence of actions, repeated in the right order, gives the mind something to hold on to when everything else feels like it's dissolving. The wake, the burial, the gathering afterward. These aren't decoration, they're scaffolding. That scaffolding is exactly what those Paleolithic communities were building, tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for psychology. They dug the hole, they placed the body, they added the ochre, the beads, the tools. Then, presumably, they gathered. They ate together. They talked about the person who was gone. None of that changed the fact of the death. All of it changed how the living carried it forward. You still do this, almost identically, whether you've noticed or not. You still gather. You still eat together after a funeral, in a room full of relatives you haven't seen in years. You still tell stories about the person, repeating the same few memories until they harden into something permanent. That isn't a modern invention. That is a genetic inheritance from a species that figured out, in the dark, without instruction, that shared ritual keeps grief from swallowing a community whole. There's one more detail worth sitting with. Many of these ancient burials were positioned facing a specific direction, sometimes east, toward the rising sun. Some researchers have suggested this reflects an early belief in an afterlife, a journey the dead were meant to take. Others are more cautious, arguing it may simply reflect the layout of the cave, or convenience, or coincidence repeated by chance. Once again, certainty runs out exactly where meaning begins. Maybe that's the most honest thing anyone can say about death rituals, ancient or modern. Nobody actually knows if they help the dead. What the evidence does show, again and again, across 100,000 years of buried ochre and carved ivory beads, is that they help the living survive the unbearable fact of loss. They always have. So when you attend a funeral next, and you find yourself repeating words you don't fully believe, standing in a line you don't fully understand, placing a flower on a casket for reasons you couldn't explain if asked. Know this: you are not performing something invented by a religion, or a culture, or a century. You are performing something a nameless human being decided mattered, in a cave, in the dark, tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down. And somewhere, right now, someone is standing over a body, deciding what to do with it. They will wash it, they will dress it, they will place it in the ground, or in fire, or in water. And in doing so, without knowing it, they will be doing exactly what humans have always done. Not moving on, just making sure the loss doesn't disappear without a trace.